40,000 voices rise from one plain, all of them shaping the same words in a single tongue, all of them smelling the same wet clay and boiling tar. Now imagine every one of those voices, on a single morning, unable to understand the man beside him. This is the story of the Tower of Babel, in the land of Shinar, around 2200 years before Christ. Consider the scene from the edge of that plain. The land between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, lies flat for as far as your eye can reach, and rising from the center of it stands a mountain that no mountain range ever produced. It was made by hands, tens of thousands of them, and two things about that structure would puzzle you the instant you arrived. Two riddles this story will answer before it ends. The first is why these builders burned their bricks in fire when every village around them simply dried mud in the sun. The second is why, sealed between the rising layers of that enormous mass, there were mats of woven reed and ropes as thick as your wrist, hidden in places where no human eye would ever see them again. Hold those two riddles. They are the difference between a pile of mud and a monument that outlived its own builders. The book of Genesis, chapter 11, opens the account with a single sentence that changes everything that follows. The whole earth, it says, had one language and one speech. Picture what that means in practice. A child born on the far side of the plain spoke the same words as an elder 100 days of walking away. A command shouted from the top of a scaffold was understood by every back bent below it. There was no translator, no gesture, no confusion. Coordination. The single hardest problem in any massive project was effectively solved before the first brick was ever laid. That is the engine of this entire story. One tongue, one mind across a multitude, and they moved as one. The text says they journeyed from the east and found a plain in the land of Shinar, the region later generations would call Babylonia, and there they settled. Examine the choice of ground, because it was not random. This was alluvial floodland, soil deposited over thousands of years by the two great rivers. Stone was almost non-existent here. Timber was scarce. What this plain had, in quantities beyond counting, was mud. Soft, fine, river-borne clay, the very material most builders would have dismissed as worthless for anything tall. Here is where the first riddle begins to open. They looked at that endless mud, and they did not see a limitation. They saw raw material. Genesis 11 records their decision with startling technical precision. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And then the verse adds a detail that no inventor of legends would bother to include. They had brick for stone, and they had bitumen for mortar, slime, some older translations call it, tar, asphalt, the black, sticky pitch that seeped naturally from the ground in this part of the world. Think about the engineering hidden inside that one sentence. Sun-dried mud brick is cheap and fast, and it crumbles. Soak it in the spring floods, and it slumps back toward the mud it came from. A tower of sun-dried brick has a ceiling, a height beyond which its own weakness pulls it apart. But brick that is burned thoroughly, fired in a kiln until the clay vitrifies, becomes something else entirely. It becomes nearly as hard as stone and almost completely waterproof. That is the first riddle answered. They burned their bricks because they intended to build something that the rivers, the rains, and the centuries could not dissolve. They were not building for a season, they were building for forever. And the bitumen was the second half of that genius. Ordinary mud mortar washes out. Bitumen, heated until it flows and then cooled between the courses, grips the fired brick and seals it against water. Archaeologists excavating the great ziggurats of this region have found exactly this, layer upon layer of baked brick set in black bitumen, precisely as Genesis describes. The nearest natural source of that tar lay near a place called Hit, on the Euphrates, roughly 160 kilometers upstream from the heart of Babylonia. That is a distance comparable to a long day's drive on a modern highway, except every drop of it had to be gathered, hauled, and carried by river and by back. Now calculate the magnitude of what one tongue allowed them to attempt. The structure they raised was a ziggurat, the stepped temple mountain of Mesopotamia, a form that would be repeated across that land for the next 2,000 years. The most complete physical picture we have comes from the great ziggurat of the city of Ur, built only a century or so after the time this account describes. Its lowest terrace measured roughly 64 meters along one side and about 46 meters along the other. A footprint larger than a modern soccer field, it rose in stages, each smaller than the one beneath, climbing toward a single shrine at the summit. The first terrace alone stood close to 15 meters high, the height of a building of 4 or 5 floors, and that was only the beginning of the climb. To raise a single such terrace, the builders needed brick by the millions. The baked brick facing of the ziggurat of Ur is estimated by archaeologists to have required tens of millions of fired bricks, and the unbaked core beneath it consumed many millions more. Picture a single course of that structure, one horizontal layer wrapping the entire base. That one ring of brick could weigh as much as several large elephants standing on the scale together. And there were dozens of courses below the first terrace alone, with terrace stacked upon terrace above, by hand, every single one. Dimension the labor force this demanded. A project of this scale, sustained over years, would have occupied somewhere between 30 and 50,000 workers at its peak, a population the size of a small modern city, all concentrated on one plane, all fed, all housed, all directed toward one summit. Consider that not one of them owned a wheel-driven crane, not one had an engine, not one had a single meter of steel. Their machines were the lever, the ramp, the reed basket, and the human shoulder. Follow the process of a single brick, because the whole tower is only this, repeated 100 million times. A worker squats at the riverbank in the grey light before the heat arrives. He digs the fine clay, treads it with his bare feet, mixes in chopped straw and water until it reaches the right body. He presses it into a wooden mold, strikes off the excess, and turns it out onto the ground to set. The standard bricks of this region were broad and flat, often around 30 centimeters to a side and several centimeters thick, and a single fired brick of that size weighed somewhere between 15 and 18 kilograms, about the weight of a full sack of flour or a healthy 2-year-old child. A worker lifted that weight, and then he lifted it again and again through a shift that ran from first light past noon, perhaps 12 hours under a sky that gave no shade. And the sun on that plain was not the gentle sun of a temperate land. In the Mesopotamian summer, temperatures climb past 45 degrees Celsius and reach toward 50 in the worst weeks, the heat of an oven with the door left open. The clay had to be worked in the cooler hours and fired in the hottest, which meant the kilns. Glowing furnaces fed with reed and dung and what precious wood could be found, added their own punishing heat to a day already at the edge of what a body can endure. Now you begin to see the human cost that the smooth lines of a finished monument always hide. Picture the body of a man who carried brick for a single year on that site. His hands were a map of his labor, the palms thickened into leather, the fingertips cracked and stained black where the bitumen had burned and bitten into the skin. The tar that sealed the tower also seared the men who poured it. Heated pitch splashes, and where it lands, it clings and keeps burning. Examine his spine, and you would read the load in the curve of it, the slow compression of carrying 15 and 18 kilograms up ramp after ramp, year after year. The lower back of a career hauler wears, in ways a modern physician would recognize at a glance, the discs flattened, the joints inflamed, the muscles knotted into permanent ache. Then there were the lungs. The kilns and the bitumen fires filled the air with smoke and fine particles, and a man who tended them breathed that haze for a working lifetime. The clay dust itself, fine as flour, hung in the brick fields and settled into the chest. Add the parasites of standing floodwater, the fevers that swept through crowded camps, the dysentery that followed any place where tens of thousands lived without true sanitation, and you have a settlement where death was not a rare visitor. It was a constant resident. Disease did not need a war to thin those ranks. It simply waited. And consider the thirst. On a plain at 50 degrees, a laboring body loses water faster than it can be replaced. And heatstroke kills quietly, dropping a strong man between one brick and the next. The water itself, drawn from rivers that carried the runoff of 100 upstream settlements, brought its own slow sickness. The food was the flat bread and the boiled grain of the poor, with little to repair the daily damage. A worker on that site spent his body the way the project spent bricks, by the thousand, without ceremony. So weigh the question of who these builders truly were, because the easy version of this story gets them wrong. They were not cartoon villains shaking their fists at the sky. Look closely, and you find ordinary human beings making choices that almost anyone would understand. They wanted security against the chaos of a hard world. They wanted to stay together rather than scatter into the unknown. They wanted to be remembered, to leave behind proof that they had lived and mattered. Genesis 11 puts their reasoning in their own reported words. Come, they said, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Read those motives again, slowly. A name, permanence, unity. There is nothing in that list a modern person cannot feel in his own chest. The tragedy of Babel is not that monsters built it. The tragedy is that decent, gifted, frightened people poured their entire collective genius into the wrong center of gravity, and the consequences ran far past anything they intended. That is the second riddle, still waiting. The reed mats, the hidden ropes. Climb the structure in your mind and watch the builder's work, and the answer reveals itself. Baked brick is strong, but a solid mass of brick rising 15, 30, 40 meters into the air faces an invisible enemy. Moisture. Rain and groundwater seep into any structure, and trapped water inside a sealed mass expands, freezes on cold nights, and tears the brick apart from within. The builders knew this, so at regular intervals, every fifth or sixth course on the great ziggurats, they laid down thick mats of woven reed. And they threaded heavy cables of twisted reed, ropes as thick as a man's wrist, running deep into the body of the structure. Those mats and ropes did two things that no casual observer would ever guess. The reed layers bonded the courses together, knitting the brickwork into a single, flexible whole, the way reinforcing mesh works inside concrete today. And the builders left narrow channels, weep holes, running from the wet core out to the open face, so that water absorbed deep inside could drain and breathe instead of bursting the walls. Excavators have found these features intact in ziggurat after ziggurat. The reed still preserved after 4,000 years in the dry interior. That is the second riddle answered. The hidden reed was the secret skeleton, the engineering that let mud reach for the sky. Nenhum engineer of that age left a written manual of this. The knowledge lived in the hands, passed from worker to worker in the one language they all shared. And that single shared language is the hinge on which everything turns. Place yourself on the scaffolding at the height of the work near the summit, where the air finally moved and the whole plain spread out below like a map. From up there, a man could see the brick fields stretching to the river, the kilns smoking in long rows, the ramps crawling with carriers, the canals dug to float materials closer to the base. He could see the housing camps, the granaries, the workshops where molds were cut and tools repaired. It was not chaos. It was a machine made of people, and the fuel that ran it was understanding. A foreman called for more bitumen, and bitumen came. A master builder corrected an angle, and the correction passed down the line without a single word lost. Nothing was restrained from them, because nothing was misunderstood among them. Genesis 11 records that this is precisely what drew the attention of God. The text says, "The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men had built." And it gives the divine assessment in plain words. "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do." Read that line as the builders never could. Their greatest strength, their perfect unity of speech, was the very thing identified as the source of an unchecked trajectory. The account does not describe a fortress under siege or an army marching to break the walls. It describes something far quieter and far more total. "Come, let us go down," the text says, "and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." Then the morning came. Imagine that ordinary day on the plain. The light arrives, the carriers shoulder their loads, the kilns are stoked, the foreman climbs to his post and opens his mouth to call the first command of the shift. And the men below hear sound that is no longer speech. Watch the foreman's face as he shouts again, louder, certain at first that the wind has stolen his words, and watch the carrier staring up at him with the same dawning horror. His own reply coming out as noise the foreman cannot hold. Multiply that single failure by 40,000. Across the entire site, in the same instant, the invisible thread that bound every hand to every other hand simply snapped. Silence had a price, and now they paid it in confusion instead. There was no battle. That is the detail people forget. The greatest construction project of the ancient world did not fall to flood or fire or an enemy. It stopped because a master builder could no longer tell a carrier what to fetch. Picture a brick set wrong and no way to explain the error. Picture a kiln overheating and the warning shout meaning nothing. Picture families on opposite sides of a single misunderstanding. Neighbors of a lifetime, now strangers separated by a wall thicker than any brick. The machine made of people came apart, not because the people died, but because they could no longer be one mind. Within hours, the work was impossible. Within days, it was unthinkable. And then, the scattering, which Genesis names as the true purpose. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there upon the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. The very outcome they had feared most, the very fate the tower had been raised to prevent, arrived as the direct result of the building itself. They had said, "Let us make a name, lest we be scattered." And scattered is exactly what they became. The tower never rose again. Examine the name that the place was given, because it carries the whole meaning folded inside it. The text says, "Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth." The Hebrew word plays on the verb balal, to confuse, to mix. Yet the city's own people knew the site by another name in their tongue, Babilu, which meant the gate of the god. Hold those two meanings side by side, and the irony stands fully revealed. The builders called it the gate of heaven. The account calls it confusion. The same syllables, the same place. Two judgments separated by an unbridgeable distance. Consider what was actually lost on that plain, beyond the unfinished brick. A generation of accumulated skill, the hard-won knowledge of how to fire brick at scale, how to lay bitumen, how to thread the reed and cut the weepholes, all of it scattered to the four directions, along with the men who carried it. But here, the providence of the account turns strange and almost gentle, because the scattering was not only an ending. The peoples who walked away from Shinar carried that knowledge with them. The technique of the baked brick and the bitumen, the form of the stepped temple mountain, spread across Mesopotamia and beyond, repeated in city after city for the next 2,000 years. The very dispersal that broke the project seeded the world with what the project had learned. The structure failed, the knowledge did not, and the bricks themselves outlasted everyone who ever cursed and bled over them. Across the plains of ancient Babylonia, the great ziggurats stood for centuries, eroding slowly, rebuilt by later kings. Their cores of mud brick and their facings of bitumen-set baked brick surviving in part even into the present day, where archaeologists still pull intact reed mats from their interiors. The men who burned those bricks for forever did not get their tower, but the smallest unit of their labor, the single-fired brick, kept its shape through 4,000 years of sun and flood, longer than any name they hoped to carve. So return one last time to the plain and to the meaning the centuries pressed into it. The account of Babel is, at its heart, a story about the limits of human unity turned toward the wrong center. Those builders proved something permanent about the species. Given one language, one purpose, and the will to spend their own bodies, human beings can raise mountains out of mud. The capacity was never in question. What the story examines is the direction that capacity was pointed, and the way a strength carried too far becomes the seed of its own undoing. There is a second movement to this account that the ancient writers placed deliberately at a great distance, and it is worth naming with a documentary's care rather than a sermon's heat. Centuries later, the New Testament book of Acts, in its second chapter, describes a scene that reads as the deliberate mirror of Babel. On the day called Pentecost, a crowd gathered from many nations, each speaking his own tongue, suddenly understood a single message, every man in his own language. At Babel, one speech was scattered into many, and the people were driven apart. In that later account, many speeches were drawn into one understanding, and the people were gathered together. Whatever a viewer believes about either event, the symmetry is unmistakable, and it is built into the texts on purpose. The confusion of the tower and the comprehension of that later morning are written as the two ends of a single arc. That is the strange afterlife of a failed building. The Tower of Babel raised nothing into heaven, yet it gave the world a permanent image for the oldest human ambition and its oldest human limit. The dream of reaching the sky by stacking enough of our own effort, and the moment that dream meets something it did not account for. The builders wanted to be remembered. By the measure they chose, the name and the tower, they failed completely. By a measure they never imagined, they succeeded beyond any monument because their plane became the place where humanity learned once and for all that understanding one another is the rarest and most fragile material we will ever build with. They poured their lives into a tower that could not hold them together. What endured was the lesson written in its collapse.